but the stories she was telling me were very true. She said that her parents and aunt and uncle had seen people trying to leave and getting their cars shot up and likely killed. They had seen all kinds of human rights violations, but I mean egregious ones during the conflict. And a lot of the stories coming out of Mariupol are kind of horrifying. And the thing is, it's not that the Russians did this. On the contrary, the populace in Mariupol views the Russians as their liberators and saviors. And apparently one of the big things was that they were able to eat food. And apparently it was quite traumatic, if you will.
A majority of the everyday people of Greek origin who are from that area have been confirming exactly what you are saying, Gonzalo. For example, here's a quote, and I'm reading this from a Greek newspaper, a local newspaper, which is a quote of a Greek in the area who says, quote, "Nobody kills anyone here. The Russians do not kill anyone. No one is shooting at civilians. As soon as the Russians came here, they immediately brought us help. Right now, immediately after the shooting stopped. No one asks us if you are Ukrainian or Greek about our origin, what language you speak. The Russians do not discriminate, while the Ukrainians did. They forced us to speak only Ukrainian, although I do not know it at all." And another Greek girl who is now in Greece as a refugee says, let me just translate.
Ουκρανοί στρατιώτες με όπλα και μας απειλούσαν κατά κάποιο τρόπο. Ενώ πιο πέρα μας σταμάτησαν ρώσικα tanks.
They stopped us, the Ukrainian soldiers, and they threatened us. The soldiers in Russian tanks tried to tell us to calm down.
All right, everyone. So this is another Ukraine-Russia video. Apparently, the Azov Battalion, which I think we've mentioned previously, is one of the strongholds of the Nazi portion of the Western Ukrainian government and military structure. And they are really doing some very egregious human rights violations, so I wanted to start off the video with that.
Every time some atrocity happens, it's usually on the Zelensky regime side, and they apply it to the Russians. It's like this weird sort of projection, which I think is psychopathic.
All right, everyone. And in case you missed my two previous videos, we're going to start with just recapping them very quickly.
This is a quick clip of the Ukrainian Nazi media calling for the extermination of the Russian people in eastern Ukraine.
Найголовніше, що треба зробити в даний момент, як це
No matter how cruel it may sound,
є певна категорія людей, яких треба просто вбити.
There's a certain category of people that must be exterminated.
This is President Poroshenko, who was put in power by United States forces, most likely the CIA, possibly MI6, whose government was propped up by U.S. tax dollars, telling us how he really feels about the Russian people who are in the borders of Ukraine.
Тому що у нас робота буде, у них немає. У нас пенсії будуть, у них немає. У нас піклування під дітей, під людей, під пенсіонерів, під дітей буде, у них немає. У нас діти підуть до школи, до дитячих садків. У них вони будуть сидіти в підвалах. Бо вони нічого не вміють робити. І так, і саме так ми виграємо цю війну.
We will have jobs, they will not. We will have pensions, they will not. Our children will go to schools and kindergartens, theirs will hide in the basements and cellars. Think he was joking? That's Joe Biden's boy right there.
Here's some of your tax dollars at work.
Beautiful woman, isn't she? Look at how adorable that little girl is. We paid for this woman and her 10-month-old baby's death.
Here's the UN death statistics for the U.S. taxpayer-funded genocide of the Russian people in eastern Ukraine by Poroshenko and then later on by Zelensky.
But you can see there's been a constant, yes, it declined, but they live in a constant, perpetual state of war.
And U.S. taxpayer-funded bioweapons laboratories in Ukraine.
Does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has
biological research facilities.
Are the Ukrainians funding their own biological weapons programs? Their biological research programs? No, you are. It was thought wise by people in a Western political class to give these people a biological research program? Is this for when I tell you these people are stupid? Ladies and gentlemen, they are stupid.
Well, the start of this conflict in Ukraine was begun when the Western Ukrainian military attacked the Donbass.
And we did say that if there was one thing that would prompt or goad the Russians into taking action, it would be an attack on Donbass and Lugansk. And around 4:35 in the morning, we got that. Throughout the whole evening, Alexander, things were really ticking up. The shelling, the artillery, rocket strikes, everything was really ticking up.
Yes.
And around 4:35 in the morning, the Donbass officials said, we need help. And, things were escalating to a dangerous level. And it looks like Russia said, okay, we're moving.
What were 60,000 troops doing next to the Donbass? I mean, why are they there such that they could be trapped? Clearly they were. And why did they have more than 2,000 violations, according to the OSCE, the weekend before in shelling the Donbass?
Yes.
I mean, they already made it a shell of a country, a shell of a region anyway. Over the prior 8 years, 14,000 or so killed, mostly civilians, many of them children. British reporters didn't seem to care about those kids.
We talked about how Putin is a great leader of his people, how he's brought them out of poverty, out of crime, out of all kinds of things. And he's proven himself yet again to be a hero of the Russian people in how he has begun this war, sacrificing political gains to save civilian lives, the lives of Russian people in Ukraine, that this is a protective war on that front.
And it tells you something about Putin. The politically smart thing to have done would have been to have waited for the Donbass to be assaulted and attacked. Now, the consequence of that might have been that those people would have been wiped out that were still there by the time Russians could get in. The fact that he chose not to do that, it tells you something about what his mindset and mentality is, that he would rather that he doesn't care about the political cover for what he's going to do. He cares more about its political and military effectiveness in terms of protecting civilian life that is Russian by ancestry and political orientation. Indeed, if you look at where Russia occupies on the map so far, where they went in to dominate land-wise, it overlaps almost directly with Russian ancestry, with Russian language-speaking regions.
And we touched on how he is the most popular world leader within the borders of his own country. His approval rating is generally around the 70 to 75th percentile. And he does not need to steal elections, nor does he need to call in the armed forces to defend himself from political opponents, nor does he need to capture and take political prisoners to keep himself in power, unlike presidents over here on this side of the world.
You're accusing him of stealing elections? Was it a couple years ago, over 2 years ago now, when they did that, and I polled Russia. I'm not exactly a Russian pollster. The guy was 76%. The approval rating was 76%. He didn't have to steal an election. There would be no reason. All right. Putin has never ordered the army to surround the Capitol after an election for him. He never fenced out protesters like Joe Biden did. Right. Currently, Joe Biden has more political prisoners in the D.C. jail than Putin has. That's just the reality.
And it's his currency. He wants the election to be seen as legitimate because he wants he wants it to actually be legitimate because he wants them to know how popular he is, because that's his leverage on everybody else in Russia.
We mentioned that Russia is using a military campaign that is avoiding civilian infrastructure damage, avoiding civilian deaths, even at the cost of Russian lives.
People have highlighted the fact that the U.S. military lost 10 times fewer people than the Russian military has at this stage in Iraq. The flip side of that is we also had killed 10 times more civilians than the Russians have at this time in Iraq, and that's using the UN's own data.
The Russian strategy is to use very strategic and measured military action to increase their ability to get what they want through diplomacy, basically a diplomacy at gunpoint, which proves that they have a different political objective than world conquering.
In order to say that there never was a shock and awe campaign, that this isn't the Russian military strategy, was to concede that the political objective wasn't the one that they said it was. I mean, those of us who didn't think Putin would go in or Russia would go in was because their narrative was he was going in for the purpose of conquest, for the purpose of dominating Ukraine, for the purpose of rebuilding the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. That was never true, and it's still not true. And the way he's gone in militarily proves that even further. He's going out of his way to avoid civilian casualties, even at the expense of Russian soldiers. I mean, if you do like the EU and the West did, and you just do all your ammunition in the economic war at once, you don't have any place to go. There's no place to escalate. You've forfeited your diplomatic tools.
Exactly.
Your leverage has disappeared. Whereas if you go in slow and say, well, we'll go a little bit further unless you settle, and we'll go a little further unless you settle. That military diplomatic correspondence, it just can't work within the West narrative of Putin.
The Russians are doing diplomacy and war at one and the same time.
And that their political goals are very clear. They've spelled them out continually, even though no one here in America seems to know what they are, though they are happy to tell you that Putin is evil for starting the war. Of course, you can't really have an informed opinion about this kind of thing unless you know why they're at war, which their reason for peace is their reason for going to war. Here's what it is.
Russia's spelled out these guarantees. I mean, they're very specific about it. Recognize Donetsk, Lugansk, recognize Crimea, denazify, and put in your constitution that you're putting your constitution that you will be neutral.
That our own military affirms that we would go to war just like Russia has if the situations were reversed.
What is his end game?
Well, Vladimir Putin is carrying through on something that he's been warning us about, at least for the last 15 years, which is that he will not tolerate U.S. forces or their missiles on his borders, much as we would not tolerate Russian troops and missiles in Cuba. And we ignored him, and he finally acted. He was not going to allow Ukraine under any circumstances to join NATO.
Which leads us to the conclusion that Russia is fighting a just war. The threat against Donetsk and Luhansk is real. Other people have been dying for 10 years now. They were under assault. That's why the Ukrainian military is trapped in the east next to the Donbass. The Nazis are real. As you have seen earlier in the video, the Mariupol Azov battalion is killing the Ukrainian civilians because they care so little about human life. They'll kill their own people to give themselves an edge. And we will go more into this in detail because it's worse than even what we mentioned earlier. And thirdly, even our military agrees that if put in the certain circumstances, we would go to war over an enemy on our borders with missiles, which again we'll go into more further. So let's just get back into everything going on in Mariupol.
Russians don't want to hit the civilians, but if the Zelensky regime's soldiers hide in the buildings, then they're going to attack them. And it's as simple as that. And we've seen this. There are videos circulating right now of a school in Odessa that has been turned into a military bunker. This is not like some random video. This was ABC News, the American broadcasting company. They had a reporter there observing this and how the school had been turned into essentially a military outpost, a military bunker. And so, of course, what are the Russians going to do? They're going to attack it, and they're going to try to obliterate it, as is their responsibility, because they want to, of course, win the war. And how do you do that? By taking out military targets. And if that means the military targets are in a school, that's very lamentable, but it'll have to be. And then, of course, you realize, then they'll turn this disaster into a PR victory to try to goad the West into joining into this conflict. I mean, the cynicism of the Zelensky regime knows no bounds. The Russians just blew up the largest shopping center in Kiev. They shelled it because it was a staging area for the Zelensky regime people. And so they just leveled it. It was just a big disaster, and apparently 4 people died. But that's the thing. See, the Zelensky regime is putting its soldiers in places that will cause harm. Like, for instance, the steelworks in Mariupol. The Azov battalion people, there was some Twitter blue checkmark system pig who said that the Russians were systematically destroying civilian infrastructure. And I was like, no, that's a lie. That's a complete lie. What has happened was that the Russians had to shell the steelworks in Mariupol because that's where the Azov battalion had gone to hide and seek shelter.
Yeah.
And so that's why they're doing it.
Yeah.
And you know, this thing of the Zelensky regime happily putting its men, its soldiers, in places that will ultimately harm the civilian population, if not harm civilians themselves. And we have seen the documentation, Azov battalion documentation, explaining exactly how to use civilians as human shields. I posted it on Twitter. Alex, unfortunately, for reasons I can't really do it on the phone, but if you can find that tweet to share with everybody,
Let me look for it.
It shows the Azov battalion telling their own people that what they should do is use the upper floors of the buildings and put on the ground floor any vehicle or tank inside a building, and use the third, fourth, and fifth floors of any building to hold civilians as hostages. I mean, they have it's there, it's real. That's what they're doing, and you know the Western media lies constantly, which it really drives me up the wall. And you see how these. I mean, they're animals. How can you even think of doing such a thing? And the thing is, see, when I saw that a few, like a week or so ago or earlier, and I thought, maybe Russian propaganda. But with the Mariupol civilians giving this testimony, the Greek Ukrainians in Greece giving this testimony, my personal acquaintance, whom I know.
So there you have it. By multiple sources on the ground in Ukraine, the Ukrainians are Nazi war criminals. That's what we've been saying for a while. That's what most of the sane people in the alternative media are saying. The ones that actually understand things going on over there. Now, Gonzalo also mentioned that the reason his friend's family was fleeing Mariupol to begin with is because the Ukrainian military, the Azov battalion, would not allow them to leave their house to get food, and that they were starving. Thankfully, when the Russian soldiers got to their position, they fed them and escorted them safely out of the country, so they're going to be okay. And now I'd like to juxtapose how the Russians have treated the Ukrainian civilians in eastern Ukraine and how they have waged war there compared to how they are doing on the Western front, the few times that they have engaged NATO forces in the West when they crossed over Poland's border.
So in one stroke, they seem to have taken out 1,200 soldiers in three separate strikes, precision strikes, high impact, very deadly strikes. I mean, this was not like the house-to-house fighting that you're seeing in Mariupol, where they're trying to not kill civilians and sort of like, no. This was, we're going to level this place. And, to be brutally frank, we're going to kill everybody who's here. That kind of attack, it must scare the NATO planners very, very deeply, extremely deeply. Yeah, I'm amazed.
Absolutely.
By it.
Absolutely. It must also show that the Russians have exceptionally good intelligence, because they know exactly where to hit, how, and where all these people are. And that, of course, corresponds with a lot of what we know about how deeply penetrated by Russian intelligence Ukraine is.
All right. So again, to recap, Russia's demands in order to bring peace and end the military conflict are the same for their reasons for war. All of these reasons are justified. Donetsk and Luhansk have been under assault for 8 years. Crimea declared their independence and decided that they wanted to join Russia. That's their thing. They can do what they want. The Nazi influence inside of the government and pretty much the entire just Western Ukrainian culture is just shocking. And as the Russian people, to have an anti-Russian Nazi extremist government on their borders, completely unacceptable. And then lastly, NATO expansion eastward. And we're going to touch on that. We're about to go into that a lot more, because when you really look at everything going on here, who is the imperialist power in Eastern Europe? Let's find out.
Once the West decided to want to manage the decline of the Soviet Union and then have a say in how it was going to be reinstituted, that was going to be a problem. People were just never going to accept that. And then the refusal to disband NATO. I mean, when you have a balancing coalition that exists and the loser loses, and that coalition does not go away, then others, if it wasn't going to be Russia, it would have been China. And China does view NATO expansion as a threat.
But ultimately, I agree with this. I mean, obviously, there's Ukraine versus Russia, but ultimately, it's Russia versus America, just as it was during the Cold War, with, of course, the important difference, the important point that, we're not talking about everybody in the US. We're not talking about every single person there. As Robert Barnes explained during our live stream, the political elite that makes these decisions in the US is extremely small. And much of the the American electorate, much of the population are very distanced from them, and in many cases don't like them.
And what I'm proposing to you today is that one of the things the media is really covering up, and it's the reason why they're lying so much about Russia and Ukraine, is because they're trying to hide something from you. That thing that they're hiding, which Russia is exposing by their military action, is the heart of NATO that is just coming up in this event in Ukraine. Now, I came across a very interesting article in the Socialist Review, which is a British Workers' Party magazine. It was written in 1999, and at the time, NATO was using the same excuse it's using right now, claiming that the war in the Balkans was causing so many civilian deaths and they needed to intervene. And the author of this, John Rees, explains that it actually had nothing to do with civilian deaths. NATO does not care about civilians, but rather they were attempting to expand NATO eastward towards Russia. Now, the map here is the one that John Rees uses in his article while talking about how the expansion so far over the last 10 years had been rather aggressive to begin with, especially considering that every party of NATO made an agreement with Russia that NATO would never expand eastward. That was part of the agreement that Russia made with NATO when it decided to secede from the USSR. Moreover, 23 years ago, John Rees warns that as NATO encroachment comes ever closer to Russia's border, the still enormous military machine of the Russian state may once again begin to look to the country's leaders like its one real asset in a threatening situation. And to confirm that John Rees was indeed correct, that NATO's involvement in the Balkan states had nothing to do with civilian lives, which they care nothing about, and they still don't care anything about today, we can confirm that in 2004 the Balkan states joined NATO. And in case you were confused when I said that NATO does not care about civilian casualties, the gold and yellow portions of that map are parts of Yugoslavia, which were added as a result of NATO involvement in wars and disrupting the region by killing leaders, which caused over 130,000 people to die. And let's not forget that in Afghanistan, we killed over 241,000 people, we being NATO involvement, 71,000 of those which were civilians. And let's not forget the disastrous Iraq War, which also was run by America with NATO involvement, which has cost hundreds of thousands to even millions of lives. And after making a peace deal with Gaddafi in Libya, we betrayed him under Barack Obama's administration and predominantly through the actions of Hillary Clinton. And by killing the dictator who was the only man who could create peace between the warring factions in the region was destabilized for 10 years, causing tens of thousands of deaths, and no one actually even knows how many people have died in that area since. I mean, if you really look at the history of American and NATO involvement in these disputes, like dozens in these wars in dozens of countries, what we've done is first of all gone in and destabilized the region by supporting militia movements, some of which we just simply ran ourselves. We would arm multiple sides in a conflict. One of the big things we've done is we've firebombed and wiped out large armies, especially if the conflict was about to be ended by a side that wouldn't submit to our ruling. So we would just go in and wipe them out like we did with Gaddafi, because he was about to make peace in the region. So we blew up his entire army so that he couldn't, and then armed three different sides in the conflict so that it went on for another 10 years until we finally got the people in charge that we wanted. I mean, look at the number of people that have died in the conflict with Russia and Ukraine so far. 850? And that's what we're just going absolutely insane over. 850 people. I get it. I mean, civilians. I mean, human life is precious. 800 people. I mean, you can't get them back. But the difference between Russians in warfare and American warfare is you need 7 digits to express the number of civilians that we kill when we fight wars. So then, considering everything we now know about NATO and their lack of any regard for human life, what is the reason for them sanctioning Russia?
Do you expect a regime change?
The regime will change, no doubt about it. Before, it might have taken 10 or 20 years from now. Who will experience their shopping checkout bills grow 2- or 3-fold? It'll be the error he will never be forgiven for.
And this was not the only reference to this. I mean, our leaders in the Senate and in the Biden administration have said the same thing, that the purpose of the sanctions is to force a regime change by damaging the Russian people's ability to buy food. And I do have a couple things to say about this. I mean, what is the difference between bombing civilians and trying to starve them by forcibly damaging their economy? I mean, all economics people know that reducing employment causes a certain number of deaths within a society. And we're doing this to Russia on purpose. At least that's our intention. Now, there are 2 questions. One is this a just or moral thing to do? The other question is it tactically going to work?
0.5% of America's daily consumption. You know what's happened? That oil just goes somewhere else. Somebody else buys it, okay? So, and also, you know, what happened, Europe is going to be the biggest loser in all of this besides Ukraine. They haven't thought through any of these sanctions. Joseph Borrell, apparently their genius foreign policy head, has even announced, we're done with sanctions. We don't have anything else to do. And it has not changed Russia's attitude whatsoever or its behavior. So they're admitting defeat. Well, Russia is self-sufficient in food. Russia is self-sufficient in water. Russia has its own industrial base. Oh my God, McDonald's closed. Oh, the world trembles. Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay. And then a cosmetic chain closed their doors. Okay. I mean, are these people serious in Washington and London? Hey, these are inconveniences. But that's what it is, and it creates an enormous amount of resentment, okay? Because Russians will say, well, who sanctioned the United States after Iraq, okay? Who sanctioned the United States for illegally bombing Serbia? The double standard is so glaring here, and it just creates a lot of resentment. Putin's public opinion numbers are going through the ceiling right now, and as George and I have said at great length, it's a lot of people here say, well, it's about time this happened because the people of the Donbass were shelled for 8 years, okay? You had this sniper tourism where Westerners would go into the Donbass with the help of Ukrainians to go to a village and start shooting people for fun. I mean, it's just grotesque. And so... Yeah. Come to an end.
Go ahead. No, I'm just saying, we showed the images last week. I think that for many people, that may have been the first time they've ever seen these images.
So it would seem that when NATO did these sanctions, not only did they not cause a regime change in Russia, but rather it showed the Russian people what the heart set of the West is toward them. And it actually justified their position in stopping NATO expansion into Ukraine. It actually proved that NATO is this very anti-Russian opponent and adversary for them that is worth stopping.
The issue isn't that it's a pro-American liberal democracy.
That's right.
The issue is that it's a deeply anti-Russian beachhead for NATO, and that's what the United States has been doing. They've been turning Ukraine into this front in a war against Russia. As for EU membership, I think that's way down in the road. I don't think that's something that the Russians are even thinking about right now. What they are concerned with, and have been for a while, is that it's going to be essentially a state created for the purpose of being anti-Russia. And that's what the Americans have been doing. See, what the Russians now look upon the West as being united in hatred for Russia. And now they look in history and say, well, when else has this happened? When we had a European continent that is just driven by hatred? Well, obviously, it was when it was led by Hitler. And of course, there was, the case of Napoleon, but particularly Hitler. And therefore, when Putin says, and he said it on February the 24th, or maybe a couple of days earlier, when he said that we don't have the right to leave our country as undefended as it was in June 1941. In other words, we owe it to our generations that came before and the generations that come afterward to make sure that no one can ever do to us what they did in June of 1941. That's addressing the Russians' feelings. And so when people just thought, oh, well, look at, if you're Russia's got this border with China and Russia's all over, NATO is just a very small thing here to the west of the country. How can it possibly be a security threat? Yes, but all of the invasions of Russia that have taken place in the last couple of 100 years have all come from the West. They don't have a problem with China. They don't have a problem with India. They don't have a problem with Iran, with Pakistan, with Africa, with the Arab world, with Latin America. The only people they have a problem with is the West. And that's why
what a great point.
Having NATO here to the West is a serious issue for them.
What a great point. I mean, really, yeah, Peter, you want to add to that? Go ahead.
I just want to make it clear, just absolutely agree with George.
100%. Yep.
Absolutely agreeing with George. The Russians don't care about the nature of the regime in Kiev. It doesn't. They don't care who's president there. All they care about is that Ukraine is not used as a conduit for this anti-Russian coalition that George was speaking about. They don't care if it's Yanukovych or Poroshenko, Zelensky. It doesn't make any difference to them. That's the problem for Ukraine, okay? That's Ukraine's problem. But if they're going to be a bulwark against Russia, then they have a problem. It's not the nature of the regime. It's the nature of the threat.
So once again, I think that's really all I need to know to see who the aggressor is in this situation in Eastern Europe. It is NATO. But let's just take a second to go back to sanctions and test whether the idea is working out well.
Let's start with Russia and the ruble. Interestingly enough, the ruble did not crash to the levels that the Biden White House was hoping and the EU was hoping. It's actually risen a little bit in the past couple of days, which is kind of odd. But what is the state of the Russian economy? And then we'll talk about the EU and the US and the global economy in general as well, with all these sanctions and everything going on. The ruble, right, the ruble in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to understand is we've got to look at what's going to happen to the Russian economy as a result of the sanctions and what the sanctions were intended to achieve. When the decision was made to sanction the Russian central bank and to freeze its reserves, the openly expressed intention was to cause the ruble to go into free fall, create an absolute financial crash. This would supposedly have led to panic in the banking system. I don't know whether you remember, we had over the weekend when that was announced, all those pictures from Moscow of people supposedly lining up at ATM machines, all that sort of thing. So there was supposed to be a massive, overwhelming financial crash, hyperinflation, all of those sort of things. It didn't happen, and it's not going to happen because the Russians had clearly prepared for it. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt now that they did prepare for it. So they took all the right decisions with interest rates, providing liquidity to their financial system. They clearly have significant financial reserves. And of course, they very rapidly imposed capital controls. And the result is that the banking system in Russia continues to operate smoothly. Ruble deposits have apparently increased. Without, money printing. There's increasing moves towards getting the ruble in terms of its internal operations backed by gold and other metals, palladium, platinum, titanium, all of those sort of things. And apparently that has been very successful. I mean, there's been apparently a heavy demand for gold, more than the banks were temporarily able to meet, but that has led to a strengthening of the ruble internally. So at least for the moment, the financial system in Russia has survived, and it is functioning normally. Now, the other big attack that has happened is that there was an attempt, obviously, to cut off Russia's oil and gas exports. That seems to be failing because Russia is too important in terms of its energy supplies to the world for that to be done at least any time soon. So the European Union continues to import gas from Russia. Oil supplies continue to flow out of Russia. I was reading on Zero Hedge that there's even a fleet of tankers from Russia heading to the United States to supply crude to the United States before the guillotine on, importing oil from Russia supposedly falls. I've had a report from a third party that, in fact, even after that happens, it would still be possible in the US to import Russian oil via middlemen. And of course, we've also seen how the Russians are now working on with countries like India and other countries like that to sell oil for rupees and other currencies. So I think that's going to take a while to sort out. And then, but anyway, that seems to be happening. So the attempt to sort of suffocate the Russian economy by closing off its exports didn't succeed either.
And the reason I wanted to use that longer clip from Alexander McClure's his take on the Russian economy is to show you that people that actually know what they're talking about give lots of details, and people that are talking about how the Russian economy is doing, the ones that are using lots of details, are all saying that the Russian economy is actually going to be stronger at the end of this than it was before. However, the American economy is going to go into a very, very bad recession at the result of this, which I will probably get into maybe in another video. But altogether, what you see here is that NATO's hatred for Russia has pushed America into deeper into recession, to attack not even the person that we consider to be the problem, but rather the innocent citizens of President Putin's nation, the Russian people, and all over lies, because they are justified in their war, and even with that said, in a way that is ineffective, because they've actually guarded their economy against our attacks. Now, in my last video, I mentioned how Putin is very outspoken in his criticism of the USSR. He believed that it was distinctly anti-Russian because the Bolsheviks went after the imperialist, communist utopian agenda where they tried to turn the entire world into a communist utopia. And they executed that agenda at the expense of the Russian people. And that's why Russia pulled out of the USSR. It was actually destroying them as a nation. And when you really look at what is happening to America today, you see the exact same thing. The reason why I would rather have Putin as president than our current president, though I did vote for Trump. I love Trump. And the Trump or Putin are actually very similar. But what we have failed to realize is that America's imperialism is actually destroying America. And the globalists in our country are exactly the same as the Bolsheviks. We've got the Ben Shapiros and the neocons in America that want us to go all over the world and conquer everyone and turn everyone into these so-called democracies which are just puppet governments that we run through the CIA. And basically, what we've done as a part of NATO is evil. And there's a lot of blood on the hands of our nation, and our nation was never meant for this. Our forefathers distinctly said that it was far better for that we don't go throughout the world looking for monsters to destroy. The American government was based off of biblical principles, such as hard work and minding your own business, and our forefathers knew the problems with imperialism, because that's why we left the British Empire to begin with. We didn't want to be them, but for some reason today, our elites do, and they're wrong. So I just wanted to come out and say that NATO is an evil empire, and it should be stopped, and America should leave it. And Russia is exactly doing what I would do in their place. Anyway, you guys have a good evening.